Example 43, buttons and buttonholes. Buttons are a very common closure found most often in the center front of a shirt or jacket or even a dress. There are various types of buttonholes. We are going to be discussing the machine-worked buttonhole, which is one that you obviously do on a sewing machine. Every sewing machine is different how it does the buttonhole. You need to make sure you have the instructions on your machine to correctly complete a buttonhole. The buttonhole consists primarily of a bar tack, and then a row of zigzag stitches that are very close together, a bar tack again at the bottom, and another row of zigzag stitches. A machine that does a good buttonhole will do the same direction on the zigzag stitch. So it will zigzag down this way, and then it will come up and do a straight stitch, and then it will start to zigzag down this, so that the direction of the zigzag stitch is the same on both sides, so you don't end up with a buttonhole that is off. If it requires buttonholes, the size of the button will be listed on the back of the pattern under notions. It's very important that you do not deviate more than 1/8 of an inch from the required button size, because the overlap on the garment is engineered so that that is a correct size button that will work with your garment. On buttons, it usually says on the back or at the bottom what is the size of the button. And you should always buy all your buttons when you are buying your fabric and notions. On your pattern, there will be a guide for your buttonholes, for the placement and also for the size of your buttonhole. But the general rule for the size of the button is that it is the diameter of the button plus 1/8 of an inch. So your buttonhole should be equal to the diameter of your button plus 1/8 of an inch. If your buttons are to be placed on the center front of your garment, then when you are cutting out your garment, you need to make sure that you correctly mark with either thread or a tailor's chalk or something, that you mark that center front line. It is a very important fitting gauge so that you know when you have completed your garment, this is where it's going to overlap. This is where the button and the buttonholes need to line up. So you would mark your center front. On a woman's garment in the front, you would have your buttonholes on the right side so they overlap the button on the left. That is in the front of the garment. If your buttons are in the back of your garment, it is the opposite. Then the buttonholes would be on the left side to overlap the right side. The most common buttonhole is a horizontal buttonhole, which means it is oriented from side to side. There also are vertical buttonholes, which are up and down. The reason the center front line is so very important is because it will tell you where to place your buttonholes. Because when you have your garment on, you want those center fronts to line up. That is how it is designed to be correct in the measurements that you went off. So your buttonhole is oriented. Your button is positioned right on the center front line. Your buttonhole is positioned 1/8 of an inch over from that center front. So if your button is 2 1/4 inches long, or 2 1/4 inches in diameter across, that means that your buttonhole would be the diameter plus 1/8 of an inch. All right? That is the correct measurement for a buttonhole. The diameter of the button plus 1/8 of an inch. When you are positioning the buttonhole on your garment, that 1/8 of an inch is 1/8 of an inch over from the center front. So here is my center front. Here is the distance of my buttonhole. And it is 1/8 of an inch over from the center front. So you can see why it's important to get the correct size button, because this really is engineered to line up perfectly. Now that we have discussed how to have the buttonhole be the correct size for the button, the next most important thing is the placement of the buttonholes on the garment. There are three main spots that you want to make sure you position your buttonholes on. The most important is at the apex of the bust. That is a very stress point where you get a lot of pulling on it. The next most important would be at the neck, and the third would be at the waist. If you line your buttonholes there, then you can position the rest of your buttonholes between those three major stress points. And everyone is proportioned differently, so you can't just use the button gauge that comes on the tissue paper, because your bust may be higher or lower, and what's important is that your garment fits you correctly. So again, always start at the bust with your first buttonhole placement and then measure off of there. I want to make sure that you understand the buttonhole placement on your garment. So let's review. This is the center front of your garment. And obviously, if your garment has buttons, it's going to have two parts that overlap. The buttonhole is determined by the diameter of the button plus 1/8 of an inch. So if I'm using these buttons and they say they are 3/4 inch, I would add 1/8 of an inch, and that would bring me up to 7/8, and that would determine my size of my buttonhole. And remember, the placement should be right at the apex of the bust, where I would orient the first buttonhole. And the buttonhole is 1/8 of an inch over that center front towards where the garment ends. So let's say here is my bust, here is my buttonhole. It's going to go extend 1/8 of an inch over, and that's where I'm going to mark it to take to the machine and sew my buttonhole. Now that is if it is a horizontal buttonhole. If it is a vertical buttonhole, which are common in shirts that have like a placket or band, so you have to orient your buttonhole vertically, your buttonhole is exactly on the center front line. All right? And your button, after you have sewn your buttonholes and you're sure they are good and you've cut them open, then you overlap your garment, and putting a pin through the buttonhole, you mark where that falls on the other half of your garment, and that is where you sew your button, always on the center front line. After you have successfully sewn your buttonholes in place, it's time to cut the buttonholes open. The last thing you want to do is take a pair of scissors and try to cut them open. The most successful way to cut open a buttonhole is with a chisel. It has a very sharp point at one end. It's like a screwdriver with a little knife blade on the end. They come in all different sizes, and you put that on the buttonhole, hit it, and you have a clean cut between those rows of stitching. Because it's very important when you cut open your buttonhole that you do not accidentally cut through any of the threads that are making up the buttonhole, thus starting them to unravel. A more common procedure to cut open a buttonhole is to take a straight pin, and you actually pin through the bar tack. This is the bar tack. You put a straight pin through the bar tack, then you take a very sharp seam ripper, and you would start in the middle and go towards that pin. All right, so you would start in the middle of your buttonhole and push that seam ripper towards the pin. The pin is going to stop you from accidentally applying too much strength and ripping into your garment. After you do the one side, you would take the pin out, pin it at the other end through the bar tack, put your seam ripper back in the middle, and cut down until you've opened it at the other end. So you're starting here, you're ripping towards that end, and then you're putting your seam ripper back in, and pushing towards that end. And that is how you would successfully cut open your buttonhole with the least chance of accidentally cutting through the threads. A lot of times people like to add maybe a dot of fray check before they cut it open to keep those threads from fraying. There will be interfacing whenever you're doing closures, buttons, hooks, snaps, eyes. There will be interfacing behind it also, reinforcing those fabric yarns so that the stress of wearing the buttonhole, cutting it open is not going to compromise the strength of the fabric. As I mentioned earlier, the correct button size is listed on the back of the pattern under notions, and it is important that you get that correct button size. Maybe off 1/8 of an inch larger or smaller, but no more. If you absolutely want to change the size of your button, then you must do this before you cut out your fabric. You must alter your pattern to accommodate that new and different button size, or else your garment will not fit, or when it overlaps, your button may hang over the edge and be unsightly. As I've often said, all the thinking goes into the pattern preparation. So here's your center front. And here's where they have your center front marked. And that is where they are figuring out that that is a correct marking for your size button. And let's say that the button that it calls for is a 1-inch button, and you really want to use a big old whomping 2-inch button. So what you would do is you would take the diameter of your button and measure 3/4 of that and add that to this front edge. So let's say I wanted to use a 2-inch button. So 3/4 of 2 inches is 1.5 inches, and that means that before I cut out my fabric, I would go to my pattern and alter it and add 1.5 inches. I would add 1.5 inches to each side of my garment. That would not change the center front line. It would just give more room for my button to fit correctly onto the front of the garment. If you were making your buttons smaller, it would be the same thing, only you would decrease. If you wanted to decrease your button size and go smaller, you would do the same thing in reverse. You would decrease the edge of that front. You would make it whatever 3/4 of the diameter of that smaller button, that is what you would remove from the front edge. As you can see, it can be a little confusing if you're new to sewing and fashion. That's why I recommend, for the best chance at success, just get the right size button. And obviously, if you add or subtract any extra distance at the center front of your garment, you need to make sure you duplicate that on the facing piece that is used to finish the edge of the front of the garment. Hey, if you have liked my video instructions so far, be sure to check out my blog. It's a lot of fun. It's got a lot of information on sewing and stores and all kinds of stuff. It's www.wesew.blogspot.com. Check it out.